Veronique is a Belgium-born, British-based, award-winning journalist and Pulitzer Prize nominee who has worked as an editor, foreign correspondent, and reporter for national and international newspapers, magazines, and websites in the United Kingdom and worldwide over the past 25 years. These include the Newsweek, the Guardian, the Times, the Telegraph, the Economist, BBC News, Financial Times, the Huffington Post, Positive News, Le Monde, Chicago Tribune, and San Francisco Chronicle, among many other publications. She writes about human rights, social and humanitarian issues, global development, and environment, telling stories of survival, resistance, environmental activism, and economic empowerment. She likes to explore solutions rather than merely exposing problems. She offers training program in constructive journalism, not only in United Kingdom, but internationally, and provides training in journalism skills and storytelling for marginalized communities and reporting diversity in areas of ethnic and religious tensions. She is bilingual and is fluent in both English and French. She has a degree in communication and criminology from the University of Louvain, Belgium, and master's in journalism from University of California, Berkeley, USA. Veronique shall speak about constructive journalism. What now? Beyond 5 Ws and 1 H. Welcome, Veronique.
Thank you. Thank you, Manju Rose, and welcome everyone. So my presentation is not about fake news or misinformation, but some tools of journalism. Oh, actually, I better share my screen first. Sorry. Right. So some tools, I think, that help strengthening democracy, because it's an approach to journalism that help engaging audiences. And that's something that Ritu, you touched on, that often our audiences disengage, walk away from what we're doing. And it's very important, actually, to re-engage them. It's also a journalism that's it's depolarizing, and usually, traditionally, journalists really like thrive on conflict. That makes good copy. But this journalism is actually trying to build bridges and communalities rather than pitting left against right, for example. And it's a journalism that explores solutions to our pressing problems. So that's something important. Because this is a very small time for the presentation, I'm going to focus on constructive journalism from the inside, to give you some tools so you understand how you can use it. And hopefully, I hope you're going to use some of those tools. But before I start, I just want to tell you briefly how I became interested in constructive journalism. And that was a long time ago, well before constructive journalism had a name, before it was something that people were practicing. I've been a journalist for a long time, and I often cover the aftermath of conflict and natural disasters. I cover human rights, social issues, so I work with homeless people, refugees. So those are serious, difficult topics. And traditionally, journalists, when we want people to pay attention to something we think is important, we used to do it by producing very hard-hitting stories, showing how devastating the situation is, how urgent it is. And we're very good at actually finding the worst case studies, the worst stories, and presenting people as desperate, helpless. And after a while, it kind of stopped working. The readers didn't want to read those stories anymore. The editors didn't commission them. And for journalists, they're quite hard to do too, because you just leave, describe the terrible situation, and then you leave, and you leave people with this. And my experience on the ground was that actually people were not pitiful victims. Most people were actually trying to rebuild their lives. They were engaged, they were helping each other, they were doing something. So I started talking with colleagues and looking for other ways we could tell the same stories, maybe adding something to our reporting. And I find actually people in many different countries trying to do something like this. And over the years, it kind of clustered into something that it's still growing. It's still kind of organic. So there is not kind of a textbook on this. So some people call it solutions journalism, and that's more like the US approach. In the UK, we call it constructive journalism. So we focus not only on solutions, but also highlighting what's working well, progress, innovation, communities coming together. But it's not that important, but the names. But what's important is the content. So I'm going to go very quickly through this because you're going to understand it better through how to practice it. But so it's a journalism that presents a fuller and more balanced picture of the world. So not just reporting on the problems, on what's broken, but what we can do to fix it and what has been already done to fix it. So we're chronicling how people are responding to the problem. We look for results. We explore resources, collaborations, solutions, focusing on strengths, growth, possibilities, and that really helps engaging audiences. We also pose new questions to those in power, experts, and apparent victims. And it's based on evidence. It's the same journalism, it's just some additional tools. So we as critical, it's not PR, it's not fluffy, it's not feel-good journalism at all. So I'm going to touch only on two main tools. One is how to find constructive journalism story ID, what is a good constructive story. And then the other one will be on interviewing, what type of questions you need to ask if you want to get some solutions, constructive material for your stories. So the most obvious one, and I think it's something that Ritu, you allude to already, is to go one step beyond the 5 Ws and 1 H. So you know that any good journalist, when we do a news story, we have to include the 5 Ws and 1 H, who, what, why, when, where, how. If we do this, we have a good, solid news story that answers all the major questions that our audiences may have. But constructive journalism goes one step further. Okay, we have this, and what now? What's the next step? And this is a set of questions you can ask yourself to find how you can take the story one step further. Those questions were designed by a journalist called Katrin Geldenstedt. She's one of the pioneers of constructive journalism, and she was the first one to try to put some of the concepts of positive psychology into journalism. And she goes all over the world to work with journalists, and when she brainstorms with them to try to find good constructive ideas, that's what she does. She calls it PERMA, just because of the name she uses. That's not important, but look at the questions. And if you're a student or a journalist and think about the stories you're reporting on or the topics you want to report on, and see if any of those questions make sense to you, if they could open something. and take you one step further, possibly. So who has solved something, handled problems, and how? Look for creativity, passion, innovation. Usually people who are passionate are willing to go one step further. Who is doing something out of the ordinary? Is there resilience? Who has helped? Look for cooperation, collaboration. Often when there is a disaster, you see actually that people do collaborate and help one another. What has been learned? New possibilities explored, and how you came to that point. Have conflict being solved in other places, something you can learn from or duplicate. And this is an example. It's one of my first constructive journalism story. I did this one for the Telegraph magazine, and it's about AIDS and HIV in Haiti. And that was actually many, many years ago, before the earthquake. And as you know, Haiti is a very poor country. There is very little infrastructure, very few doctors. There is a lot of corruption, a lot of gang violence. Many people live in crowded slums. And HIV is not, at least at the time, was not seen as a disease, but as a curse. As a curse that could only be treated by seeing a voodoo priest. But also because it was seen as a curse, the stigma was enormous, and people who were HIV positive wouldn't try to take medicine and go to the hospital. They would hide their status, because if people know their family would leave them, they lost their jobs, their housing. So it was quite terrible. And then there were thousands and thousands of AIDS orphans. So I had all the ingredients to do a hard-hitting story. But then I asked myself some of those questions, some of those perma questions. Has anyone done something out of the ordinary? Who is passionate? Who is trying something new? And asking those questions, I found that there was actually a group of grandmothers. They're HIV positive, they're uneducated, they're poor. They live in Cité Soleil, which is the largest slum in Port-au-Prince, the capital. And when many NGOs decided to leave the country because it became too dangerous, they said, okay, we're going to look after the people who are HIV positive in our communities. And they look at after 250 families, and they told them, look, it's not a curse. I am HIV positive. If you take a combination of medicine regularly, this is how you can manage to still have a good life. They explained, they educated people, they told them how to stay healthy. And it really worked. And my story covered exactly the same things I would have covered otherwise, but I used those inspiring grandmothers as my guide. And it really helped people to engage and to want to read the story. That story had a huge impact, maybe larger than I would have had if I hadn't used them. So those are other elements that you could think when you do a constructive or a solution story. And those comes from the Solutions Journalism Network in America, and they're moving into Europe too. It's a fantastic organization, and maybe after the presentation I could send you some links, but it's really worth looking at what they're doing. So they say that in order to have a constructive or solution story, you need insight. It's something we have to learn from. It should be useful for other people. You should be able to apply it elsewhere. Then how done it, you need to explain in details how the result was achieved. Evidence, you have to show that it works. You have to show statistics, facts. Sometimes if you don't have all the facts, you can use qualitative evidences, interviews, experts. You can say, well, it looks promising, but we don't have all the data yet, but you need to have something. And this is interesting. It doesn't have to be a success. Sometimes you learn by failure. If something doesn't work, why? Why doesn't it work? Then you can learn something that way. So I'd like you to have a look at those three possible stories and think, would they make good constructive stories or not? And usually I would leave you a bit of time and we'll do it together. We'll see what people say, but because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to do it, and hopefully you can think for yourself how you feel about this. But look at this story. An immigrant wins a national song contest and becomes a celebrity. So that's kind of a nice story that I could see a newspaper publishing it, but it's not a constructive story, because that immigrant either was very lucky or had an amazing voice, but it doesn't help other immigrants. It doesn't shed light on immigration or integration. You cannot move the story. It's just a one-off. So a non-profit sets up a football team for recent immigrants to play with locals as a way to improve integration. Here you could say, well, it's only one football team in one city, so maybe not. But if you think about it, first, sport is a very good way to integrate new immigrants. You don't discuss politics, you play football. It's a really unifier. But then it goes beyond the football team. So you'll interview people from the football team, you will interview some immigrants, but then you'll see that it has impact on their friends, their families. It really can expand from this. And then maybe a friend from the football team is going to start another team in another part of the city. It's something you can learn from, you can reproduce. And the last one, your city has a low number of people participating in language classes for immigrants. A story shows that another city has a much higher participation rate. Well, that'll be a very interesting story. So you'll compare the two cities, you look how they do it exactly, what's different. Maybe the other city provides childcare for the immigrants. Maybe the classes are offered at a different time. So you could have a very interesting article for your local paper, for your city, showing how they could do it better, improve on this. So the other thing I wanted to touch with you is the type of questions you can ask to get some constructive element into your stories. And again, it's Catherine Geldenstedt who used those 4 names for the type of questions you can ask. Again, it doesn't matter the name, but what's behind it is interesting. So she said journalists usually ask questions only from the detective and the anthropologist's point of view, but not the others. And you'll see why it might be a good idea to expand the way we ask questions. So the detective, well, we know that, and of course journalists do that, and it's the most important part of our job of our interviewing tools, to ask what happened and why and when, and you want to understand everything. To investigate. We're really good detectives. That's a second nature for journalists, and that's the most important, maybe, part of our questioning. But then there is also the anthropologist trying to find context. How did you feel? How do you explain this? And I think journalists do ask those questions. But then the one she says journalists don't use enough is the future scientists. So she says those are reflective questions, where the interviewer suggests a new perspective on a given topic, nudging the interviewee to reflect on new possibilities. So the questions are like, what do you think John believes when he's in that situation? How would you approach that problem? Which action should be taken by the Prime Minister to achieve this? So you kind of open something. And if you ask those questions to some people who usually don't like to speak with journalists, they might answer, because they are not aggressive questions, but they're questions that open the dialogue. And then the future scientist, it's more putting people into, to put them to say, what needs to be done? Will you do it? When will you do it? And I think journalists do this, but it's the future scientist type of questions I think that we need to include in our journalism more. And I'm going to give you an example from the Dutch online global crowd-funded platform, The Correspondent. They did a story on a repatriation office. So the repatriation office is the repatriation center is where people who have applied for asylum and were denied have to wait until they're deported. So that's kind of a really hard, sad place. And usually officials working there don't like to talk to journalists, because journalists would ask, how can you live with yourself doing that horrible job? But the journalists there spent actually a long time there. And he asked officials, various officials, if you were the minister in charge of immigration, how will you organize this center? How will you handle it? And then if you were in charge of the center, how would you work those cases, deal with all those cases? And apparently the officials came with interesting, humane ideas, and the journalist compiling her report or his report included 5 recommendations from those officials, and apparently it helped informing the repatriation way in the Netherlands. So it had an impact. Okay, this is some other good questions that you could ask to do constructive journalism. How much does it cost? How long does it take? That's always important for any type of reporting. But if someone wanted to copy this, what would they need to know? That's a good question. This one I really like, and I think you all have to ask it for any type of journalism you do. What is the question nobody is asking? And I think it's a great question, because as journalists, we have an agenda, we know what we want. But when we interview people like a refugee or a homeless person, they know things, they live it. And often we don't ask the questions they think we need to ask. So that's a really good question to ask. And then if you had a magic wand, what is the one thing you would change? Again, that's a question that could unblock open things. So I'm aware of time. So this is the very last thing I want to show you, and then I'm done. This is the type of, as I said in the beginning, it's a type of journalism that tries to depolarize issues and conflicts, to point to similarities, to build bridges, instead of just to try to have dynamic conflict, because that makes good copy, and we train to do that, to say, well, Trump said that, how do you answer this? And this was something that the New York Times did, so it's a while ago, as you say. It's when it was a campaign, Hillary Clinton against Trump. And if you remember, it was a very, very polarized campaign. The Trump supporters thought the Clinton supporters were in their bubbles, intellectuals who had no idea how the people lived. The Clinton supporters thought the Trump one were just had no clue, they were manipulated, they were idiots, really. And people were quite aggressive, and it was really, people were very angry. And the New York Times paired people from all over the country, one person supporting Trump, one person supporting Clinton. And I think it was such an interesting experiment. And they gave them a list of questions. And from those questions, those are the ones that I think you could use when you interview any left or right, or people who are in opposite places. Religious, it could be ethnic, it could be everything. But those questions actually try possibly to show that maybe there is something in common. So what is a position that my candidate held you agree with? What is a trait you find positive about my candidate? What is something you don't like about the candidate you voted for? Is there anything you are hopeful about in a Trump presidency? Is there a goal Clinton talk about that you could get behind? What do you think we agree on? So in conclusion, constructive journalism tries to spark constructive dialogue and collaboration. It's forward-looking. It shows that change is possible. And again, that's important when we look at, climate change issues like this. People need to know that there is a way forward, that there is hope. It holds the power into account by showing solutions elsewhere. It's easy for politicians to say, well, we tried, but it doesn't work, we don't have the money. But if you could show, well, those people in another city managed to do it, how come you're not doing it? So it is holding power to account. It creates civil dialogues, depolarization. It engages and empowers audiences. And also, it's just some additional tools you can use, but it's the same journalism. It's not something different. So you have the same values and ethics as you always have. Okay, that's it. And it's just good journalism. That's what students, when I run a summer academy for journalists in Greece, that's what they said after 3 days. They say it's just good journalism. And I agree. I think it should be incorporated in any type of journalism. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronique. And our participants have many questions for you. Nino PK shall moderate